Diversity. We are talking about diversity more now than ever. And when we speak about diversity, we often default to the legal obligations of diversity. So we often default to the terminology of discrimination. We often default to the things we can be held accountable by in law. But true diversity is inbuilt within a system or an organisation in terms of its tolerance, acceptance, and appreciation of difference. Not just of legally defined difference, but actual difference. Difference in the way that we think, in the way that we feel, in the way that we understand, and in the experiences that we've had. Diversity means that we bring in an acceptance and an appreciation of the difference, rather than a frustration that it complicates the process of relating or the process of getting tasks done. Because what diversity requires is more presence, and it requires more understanding. And sometimes within systems and organisations, we like to get on with the task, which can in fact create a bigger issue further down the line for diversity and the task being completed. Let me give you an example I see a lot. I see in a lot of meetings, teams or managers come together and make a decision. And they make it a decision by unconsciously or consciously excluding certain voices from the decision. They get their teams on it, they action a few things, and then it gets somewhere and it gets stopped. And it gets stopped further down the line because that voice that was excluded is now having to assess the situation. And so then we have teams and managers frustrated with the level of work that they've done that has now been stopped further down the road. The truth is, when we look at that systemically, and when I'm in organisations and I look at what's happened, it becomes really clear that had the voice been included sooner rather than later, a little bit more work would have taken place in the beginning to set up the trajectory of the work more effectively and minimise the stopping points later on in the journey. So what might take a little bit more time now can actually streamline the process for later. But because we're human and we like to rush things on and we like to produce and hand things over, we tend to exclude voices, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and exclude experiences and points of view so that we can get our task done. And then we become resentful when later on it's handed back to us as insufficient or incomplete. And then we have to go back and include the voice in the first place if our organisation has some obligation to that voice, such as, quality, legal obligations, the quality of output. If we have a very tight-knit group of people making decisions for the organisation, then the organisation is not meeting the diversity of the customer on the other end. And so there's lots of reasons why diversity is good, but there's also lots of reasons why we don't engage in it and why we tend to engage in it only on legal obligation level. So something to think about. In the beginning of the process, and this is a very typical dialogical organisational development approach. In the beginning of the process, what voices are in the room and what voices aren't in the room? And how do we bring them into the room now instead of forcing our point and pushing forward so that we don't get stopped later on after all the effort and we don't buy into this resentment of the additional voices that we have consciously or unconsciously excluded. Diversity is about including difference and understanding the many aspects involved in producing any outcome for an organisation so that we benefit from a broad understanding rather than a limited point of view. And while this can be frustrating when we have a deliverable, it's even more frustrating to tell our teams that we can't go any further because we excluded voices. And now we all know that that's not what we say, but we know that when it gets stopped, there are often voices that we could have included and buy-in that we could have engaged before bringing it to the point that we brought it to. And that's something to think about in terms of diversity beyond a superficial or legal obligation, but actually how inclusive and diverse are we in our processes. And every team can look at themselves and every manager can look and see, do I include the voices that I might see as more difficult? to implement sooner rather than later? Or do I hide it, avoid it, or dance around those voices because it's uncomfortable in the beginning and it will feel chunkier in the beginning than if I was to just push ahead? And so pushing ahead is often a form of exclusion that we don't consider. I'd love to know your thoughts on it, whether you're interested in diversity and inclusion or not, or even if you're just interested in organisational performance. Are we limiting organisational performance through a lack of actual diversity and difference in our processes? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.